The death of God is about the drying up of a horizon of meaning and of a whole form of human life.
Where do we stand in the illusion it makes? What kind of space are we invited into?
The material relations between people become social relations between things. When we look at toasters, corn, and TVs,
we still, to a large extent, live in the interregnum between worlds, if you will, or between paradigms. Not many people in the history of the world have faced that.
Zero Squared is the Zero Books podcast. Daniel Bessner is an intellectual historian of U.S. foreign relations. He is the author of Democracy in Exile. He is also the author of an essay for Foreign Exchanges entitled The American Empire and Existential Enemies, which is what we're going to be talking about today. In your essay, you wrote that after World War II, many Americans began to view geopolitics within a Schmittian frame. And my question here that I wrote down was, who was Karl Schmidt, and how did he, one-time Nazi, come to influence Americans and American politicians?
So this is a pretty complex question. So Karl Schmidt was basically a jurist in Germany, in Wilhelmine Germany, and then Weimar and Nazi Germany. And over the course of the 1920s and early 1930s, he wrote a series of books that proved very influential. One of these books argued that the most important distinction in politics is that between friend and that between enemy, that politics could ultimately be defined in the final analysis by who is on your side and who is not on your side. And Schmidt argued this, but why it gets a little complicated is that Schmidt wasn't the only one arguing this. Schmidt later became a Nazi, and for that reason, understandably, a lot of his ideas were discredited. But in the 1920s, historians like myself and others have discovered that a lot of people were thinking along Schmittian lines across the political spectrum. That the sort of relatively rapid creation of German democracy after World War I think, put a lot of very basic political questions came to the fore, right? In the United States, we've had a democracy, obviously a very imperfect one, but broadly speaking, some form of democracy since 1776, which wasn't true in Germany. And so once the Weimar Republic got going, people started to ask themselves fundamental political questions. And I think what made Schmidt so influential was that he put what everyone was saying and thinking in a very pithy way. Very quickly, that which defines politics is a distinction between friend and enemy. And I think this became a defining characteristic of how Americans understood the world, partially due to the influx of European exiles who came to the United States during the 1930s and brought Schmittian ideas with them. And so you have that intellectual strand, and then you just have the material reality, right? The United States did face off in a war against Nazism, which could, I think, reasonably be understood as some form of generally existential threat to the United States. And this profound experience, I think, led many Americans to conclude that geopolitics was ultimately about that division between friend and enemy. So after World War II, when you have Stalin, who appears to many people to be a dictator similar to Hitler. You have the Soviet Union, which appears and was an ideological enemy of the United States. It appeared to many Americans that they could actually take the ideas that they had developed, these Schmittian ideas that they had developed to understand Nazi Germany, and apply them to the Soviet Union. And I would say more than that, Americans actually institutionalized this Manichaean, this dualistic perspective in institutions like the National Security Council, like think tanks like RAND, which were essentially emergency institutions that existed outside of normal democratic structures. So I think that's how he came to influence U.S. foreign affairs.
Okay. And so Schmidt or any of the other thinkers in the 20s who were thinking along these lines believed that the friend-enemy distinction was key to understanding politics and geopolitics, maybe particularly. But how was that friend group formed, according to Schmidt?
It depends at different times and different places. So Schmidt was, on the conservative side of the spectrum, he was thinking very much in German nationalist terms and racialized terms. But in the United States, that was, it was racialized in certain perspectives. But I would say after 1945, it was like whether you were a Democrat or not. And now, of course, who was a Democrat changed according to who you asked. So the United States was just fine with overthrowing democratically elected governments. like Mohammad Mossadegh in Iran in 1953 and Yacobo Arbenz in 1954 and elsewhere throughout the world from then on and even earlier. But still, they could use this rhetorical distinction in order to create a community of who was in and who was out. And who was in and who was out changed according to time and changed according to the very people that you might be asking.
So this kind of understanding of politics might not have emerged in a time where the nation state wasn't as dominant. Like, I mean, in the 19th century, my vague understanding is that Europe went from being a series of, a bunch of different territories dominated by empires to distinct national groups. Nations were formed, republics were formed. 1848 was largely about that. It didn't really get completed until after World War II. So was this kind of thinking something that was emerging with the project of bourgeois republicanism?
Yes, I think so. And I think what's so complex about European history, particularly in the 19th and 20th centuries, but even earlier, is that you have two types of sovereignties, because there is, like, for the British Empire and the French Empire, but there's also the British nation. There's also the French nation. And these are competing ideologies that, it depends on where you look in the society, which one will dominate. Eugen Weber, the great historian, has a book called From Peasants into Frenchmen, which argues that, before World War I, most peasants identified with their region as opposed to with the nation. But it was over the course of World War I in the 20s and 30s that the French nation really becomes this idea in people's minds. So it's a very complex question that changes over time. But I would say the friend-enemy distinction is essential to understanding modern nationalism and modern liberalism in the West, by which I mean really the North Atlantic, Germany, France, the UK, and the United States above all. It's really critical to understanding the formation of Western polities after World War II, when these nations become very solidified and you begin to get talks of discussion about the American century. Right, you begin to get discussion about how this one nation is in fact identical with global interests. So these things are flowing in and out over time, and they exist together and they inform each other and they're mirrors of each other while they're at the same time distinct. It's a very complex historical process.
And so who would become an enemy in this period? What kinds of things would put you in the enemy camp from this Western ideological perspective?
So I think really it's World War II that's really crucial here. I think World War II, and as the historian Stephen Wertheim argued, the early years of World War II, when France fell to the German blitzkrieg in the summer of 1940, this really freaked Americans out, because they were like, liberalism will naturally happen, capitalism will naturally spread, liberty will naturally spread, and there are other nations that could defend it. But when France fell, Americans were really like, holy shit, it's really going to be up to us. So over the course of World War II, they developed both the material bases of empire, literally weapons, getting bases from the British, but also the ideological bases of empire, which is the idea that liberalism and U.S. destiny depended on United States global empire, and what they termed euphemistically global leadership. So again, during World War II, the enemy is the Nazis. But after World War II, who's the other big empire that has a totally different way of understanding the world that also seems to want to create a new world in its image? And that's the Soviet Union. And so very quickly after World War II, by 1949, the latest, when the Soviets first detonated an atomic weapon, and then second, the Chinese, the West, quote unquote, lost China to Mao's communists, those two events really spurred Americans to identify a new enemy with global communism generally, and more specifically the Soviet Union. And I would say over the course of the last 75 years since World War II, the United States has moved from enemy to enemy to enemy to justify its global presence.
So do you think that this ideology that came out of the United States after World War II was as grounded in a political project as the Soviet project was and the Soviet ideology was? Were we really looking at two powers that were seeking global domination? Was this two different visions of revolutionary change for the world at that moment?
I think I would say yes, no. I would say the American project was a capitalist liberal capitalist project, the idea that free markets will lead to free peoples. I think that was really the basis of it. And I think the Soviets did have this Marxist-Leninist project, but personally, I don't think the Soviets ever had really global aims. I think that Stalin wanted a couple of things. He wanted to prevent another invasion of the Soviet Union, which had occurred twice in a generation, right, during World War I and World War II. And he wanted to do that through the creation of a security buffer zone in the Soviet Union's west, which is Eastern Europe, and on the Soviet Union south, which is like Central Asia and the Middle East, depending on what you define it. I think those were not only Stalin's, but the Soviet Union's goal. I think the Americans, due to their Puritan heritage, their universalistic idea about global salvation, had a genuinely global vision, distinct from the Soviet Union. And that global vision was tied directly to protecting free markets and the global exchange of goods and capital. So I think what you have is one power, the United States, with a genuinely global vision, and another power, the Soviet Union, with a regional vision. And you could just see that in the fact that the United States constructed 750 military bases over the course of the last 75 years, which dwarfs the amount of any other country.
You know, Karl Marx, when writing about the utopian socialists, I think, noticed that the step towards socialism and freedom could be traced back at least to the Reformation. That there's a Christian, Protestant, even streak within the struggle for socialism, right? And certainly in 1917, when the Soviet Union was begun, the idea was that this was one step towards a global socialist society, and what was going to happen next was Europe would have its revolution next. And 1919, discredited that notion. But so yeah, by the time Stalin came around, certainly it's true that he didn't have those same ambitions, but the project did have global ambitions, right? And
yeah, I would say I talk about this a lot with my friends. I think the big missed opportunity was a German Revolution of 1919. If there was a German Revolution in 1919, i.e. a revolution in an actually industrialized country that was able to link up with the Soviet Union and then promote like a genuine global socialist/communist project, things would have gone differently. But in my historical opinion, I think that dream was dead by after the World War II period. When you get socialism in one country, et cetera, et cetera. So while I do think the Soviets did have this genuinely global project in mind in some sort of future, it wasn't realizable in a way that the global capitalist project was realizable for the United States. And there's a lot of reasons for that. The Soviet Union was a much less industrialized society in 1917. The United States had the free security of the Atlantic and the Pacific Oceans. The United States had an abundance of raw materials that it was able to exploit as an industrializing country over the course of the 19th and 20th centuries. So I think the practical realities of the geography and the material basically made the global capital project realizable in a way that the global communist project wasn't realizable and was understood as not realizable really after World War II. Now you get a shift in the 70s when the Soviet Union does begin to support more global communist projects in what was then called the Third World and what's now called the Global South. But I think a lot of analysts said that actually led to an overstretch of the empire that helped contribute to their ultimate downfall, particularly in Afghanistan, but also elsewhere in Africa.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I just can't help but see a parallel between the bourgeois project to extend market freedoms around the world and the Soviet project to liberate workers and free humanity in a global project. It's like, and they weren't even like the Marxists also believed like developing capitalism may be a necessary step towards socialism. And there are lots of debates over how to view imperial projects from the West within the Marxist Communist Party and so on. I mean, obviously, opposition won the day, right? Anti-imperialism won the day, but it was not clear just exactly where to stand.
And that's the orthodox Marxist position. The orthodox Marxist position is you need capitalism. That's what that I think. I mean, I think that's what Marx thought. I think Marx thought capitalism was very on the way to socialism. And so there was a lot of arguing, as you are well aware, within the sort of the various internationals, and particularly within the Soviet Union, about what that actually meant. What does it mean when you actually control a country that has wars and things like that?
My next question is this ideology of good versus bad nations that centered around the question of democracy, although not very consistently at all. I mean, that became operative. We clearly now live in a time where the good guys are whoever we say they are, and the bad guys whoever that we say they are. But that ideology formed. But do you think that that there were other pressures to become an American empire after World War II that also drove our actions and our interventions? And I have another question about what internally was going on in the United States, but I'll just leave it there.
Sure. I would say I would divide the pressures into three categories. Sort of the ideology that we just talked about with this is globalizing thing. This fear about security, particularly the advent of atomic weaponry, really did freak Americans out because that threatened to end the free security that I just spoke about. And also, global trade. I think global capitalism and global trade and protecting sea lanes, protecting shipping lanes, ensuring American capital access to foreign markets, ensuring that the United States would be able to import consumer goods, where it was absolutely central to the creation of the American empire. And it's, I think, the interaction of those three broad spheres, again, ideology, security, and economics, that really explain the particular form that the American empire took. And, which one is emphasized depends on where you look. In the State Department, they might be emphasizing more capitalism. In the military, they might emphasize security more. In the Treasury Department or the executive, they might emphasize security and capitalism. If you're looking at, the intellectuals, they might emphasize more ideology. And it really depends on where you look to see which one was causally more important in engendering the particular form that the American empire wound up taking in the Cold War.
And during that Cold War, the good guy, bad guy, friend enemy distinction played out internally as well.
Okay. Yeah, very much so. With the McCarthyism and the Lavender scare, and really the Cold War provided the justification for the destruction of the left. I always say the big moment in the American left's destruction was the Cold War, because that provided the American state, which, the American state isn't as powerful before World War II as it is after it. You get the creation of literal state institutions and state bureaucracies, and the Cold War provided the logic of being able to go after the old communists, being able to purge industries, going after the Panthers in the late 1960s, all the various split-offs of SDS and the New Left. All of this was justified through a Cold War logic, and not only justified, all of these institutions had money due to the Cold War, due to the struggle against communism. So I think that it's the friend-enemy distinction, which was created, I believe, mostly initially for an international perspective, very quickly within a couple of years, comes home and really results in the destruction of the organized American left that I would say we haven't even fully overcome today.
Earlier, you did mention that controlling the shipping and keeping pirates out, basically, of international waters, and controlling those lanes was a part of the justification for the dominance of America after World War II, during what was, I guess, the American century. And it seems to me that there might be international support for the American power precisely for that reason today, that does serve a material function, and the Europeans and maybe even the Chinese are happy to have America do that job for them rather than do it themselves. Am I way off base here?
There is, particularly again in the North Atlantic, there's a consensus for American empire amongst the elites. And I would say even throughout the global South, a lot of the sort of newly financialized elites really do support American empire because they personally benefited from it. Now, whether, for example, the opinions of an elite person in, let's say, India mirror what the opinions of the entire society, I would be doubtful for. But there's certainly a consensus. Now, the Chinese, the People's Republic of China, I think, is interesting because I don't think China, again, like the Soviet Union, I don't think China wants to be a truly global hegemon. China has no interest, I don't think, in having a real presence in the Western Hemisphere. However, I think China does have a genuine interest in being the regional hegemon in East Asia. So I think that China does kind of like the arrangements to some degree. It's set up with the United States essentially serving as the export market for all of the consumptive goods that it creates. China needs to send those elsewhere, but China doesn't want a ring of bases surrounding it in East Asia, which is like that currently exists in South Korea, or support for Taiwan. So I think there's two logics happening. China likes to some degree the economic relationship because it's basically the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, has premised its legitimacy on development, and it needs these export markets to create this development. While at the same time, there's this security threat from the United States by forever remaining in East Asia, which the United States, again, does. The United States has an enormous presence in East Asia. So that, I think, explains a lot of the American tension right now, the American-Chinese tension right now.
Yeah, well, in your essay, you say that there may be a new Cold War starting with China that's driven by the same ideology that came out of World War II, the good guys versus bad guys ideology. And I just wonder, why should we think of it in those ideological terms rather than in terms of the conflict that arises between major powers economically, especially during a time of continual up and down, but mostly down, economic crisis that we've been going through since 2007?
I don't think we should only think of it in ideological terms at all. I think it's just one element of an incredibly complex historical process. I think the economic processes that you're defining have an enormous impact on U.S.-Chinese relations, particularly with the so-called rise of China, i.e., the development of China, and China's adoption of essentially an authoritarian capitalist model vis-a-vis the United States. So I wouldn't say it's the only thing to focus on. I think it's a thing to focus on, and I think that one of the things that I, as an intellectual, could do, I'm not an economic policymaker. I trade in ideas. So what I could do is try to, put ideas out in society, because I do think that, if we're going to use Marxist terms, the base and the superstructure inform each other. The famous Marx quote, men make their own history, right? So in some sense that means that ideas matter, right? Like how one understands and frames the world shapes how they make their own history. So I think that the ideological terrain is an important terrain of struggle, but certainly not the only one, not even necessarily the most important one, but it is the one that I operate in.
Do you think that because you said in your essay that you thought the role of the left right now should be to campaign against moments where there might be threat escalation in Washington, say, after September 11th? There was certainly a sense of threat escalation in America. And now the Republicans are also selling the threat from the Chinese as a kind of existential threat against the United States. But it doesn't seem to me that the powers that be, the Biden administration, are going to play into that very much. Maybe I'm misguided there. But do you think that if we basically start to emphasize how we can have peaceful coexistence with China, that could do the job of undercutting the tensions that are arising? And I'll just throw in, especially if those tensions are arising not only for ideological reasons but also material ones. And then I have another question to follow up, but go ahead, I'll let you answer that.
Sure. Well, I would say Biden and the Biden administration generally has taken a pretty aggressive approach to China. I think look at statements that they've made. They've actually been pretty bad on China and in terms of escalating tensions. And this is just my personal belief, but I think that I don't think a U.S.-Chinese war or even U.S.-Chinese conflict would redound to anyone's benefit, particularly given climate change. And I think that you need to deal with China, which I believe remains the world's largest emitter of carbon, to address the ultimate material and geographic reality of climate change, which I see as the fundamental problem of the 21st and 22nd centuries coming up. So that's what I would say. I would say, like, if I'm looking at the world and I'm saying, what is the major problem? It's not great power competition. It's the threat of climate change and what that could do not only to the United States, but to people throughout the world. And we need to deal with China. We need to deal with India to address carbon emissions. And to me, that's the major problem.
What do you think about people who say, well, the way to reduce carbon overall is to increase it now, because we have to see the development of India and the development of China reach its full fruition, and so that they can deindustrialize and get the technology in, like Europe and the United States has, which has been effective in reducing carbon.
Right.
But we can't block their development in order to get carbon emissions reduced.
This is the big problem. These countries need to develop. But the question is, do we have the technological capacities to make them develop in a non-carbon based way, not so much focused on carbon? So what I would say, if I was dictator of the world, what I would say, let's do like we did during World War II, when we basically put all the scientists and gave them all the money and they developed radar and atomic weapons in like 4 years. Let's do that with developmental technologies, right? Like that's what I would do. And then that's the type of program that I would be promoting, because I agree. You can't say China and India stop. Oh, the West developed in the 19th and 20th centuries. We're good and fuck you. Now you're not going to develop. There needs to be some sort of global solution. But the question then is, it just doesn't seem likely, given history, that if this developmentalist carbon-based path is pursued, that then that developmentalist carbon-based path will be abandoned. Because I don't think we've really abandoned it here in the States. We still fly an incredible amount, we still drive an incredible amount, and we're still using fossil fuels. So in my ideal world, we'd have some sort of global program that pursues the type of developmentalist technologies which I think are necessary in a more climate-friendly way.
Yeah, well, we're getting off onto a subject which is not my level, not really what I'm an expert in, or you probably on the climate science side of things. Although maybe I'm wrong. Do you have some background in climate science?
Just vague,
Yeah.
nothing real.
Yeah, I mean, it's a real problem because, I mean, I'll just as an aside, sometimes I dip my toe in to see what the right wing is doing. I have one particular person who sends me links to like wacko stuff. But if you look at like the World Economics Forum's writings around the Green New Deal and something called the Great Reset, and the emphasis on lowering our carbon emissions and therefore our use of fuels, it does start to have an authoritarian tinge. Their vision for the future, no one will own property, especially from a free market Western perspective. It's very scary stuff. But even from a socialist perspective, I worry about the power that big tech and the corporations and the state are going to be getting if this is our future. And the main thing that I worry about is that there will be basically austerity measures put forward that serve a couple of functions, but it will be put forward with the ideological cover of trying to do something about climate change. So
I totally agree. I mean, this is the problem, right? Like capital is so dominant.
right.
The American state is so dominant. Like this is the major problem for the left, right? Like we live in an era where we're not particularly strong. So then what do we do? Because I think you're exactly right. I think it's very likely that these rhetorics will be appropriated by capital, by this American security state for its own ends. And I totally agree, and I have no solution to that. Barring revolution.
Thanks a lot. So we can be pessimistic and depressed together. I think that my other question was, do you think that the conflict between the United States and China has something to do with the American population's sense that they're experiencing a decline in living standards, especially maybe the white population, but really across the board, and that this puts them in conflict with the Chinese who are developing? So they see development happening, massive roads in China. The life expectation is going up and up and up. The length of time people live is going up. In the United States, where this generation is expected to die sooner than the previous generation. And our infrastructure is falling apart. And if you look at the infrastructure, program that we have, it's a lot of money, but it's not the kind of money you'd have to throw at the project if you wanted to build high-speed rail across all the United States, and it's not the kind of and it covers things that ought to be covered in other ways, like in-home care nursing is included in our infrastructure package now, and given this kind of politically correct language to justify the fact that we have such inadequate healthcare in the country. So there's a feeling like the masses here are suffering, and the Chinese success has some, like, it's a zero-sum game, and the more they succeed, the more we're going to fail. How do we undermine that perception, and is there any truth to it?
I mean, I'm a Marxist, so yeah. I mean, like, absolutely. Yeah, I think people are worse and more mean and more likely to do things that we would disapprove of when their material conditions are wanting. And I think it's difficult to say that the material conditions in the United States aren't wanting for the vast majority of people. And I guess, I mean, this is just the reality that we live in, a world of billionaires where Amazon workers are so afraid that they're so afraid to even unionize when they're pissing in bottles and shitting in bags. I mean, this is the world that we live in.
What's going on with that is I heard that the count's coming in and the Amazon workers are voting.
Lost.
Did we lose?
We lost by, like, my understanding is quite a bit. But that just shows, again, in this world of capital, right? And people are afraid, and people are angry, and people are vicious, and they have a right to be angry, and they have a right to want more of their leaders. Absolutely.
And this has been a bummer of a conversation. I just want to say, from the bottom of my heart, fuck you.
Thank you.
I didn't know we had lost. I just heard that we were losing.
No, we lost. Yeah. So, I mean, this is the problem. I mean, I completely agree. We have to make a world where that isn't the case, where people aren't afraid, where people have basic material things that are easily available, given to them. And beyond that, I think more conflict is inevitable, more social strife, more social instability is inevitable.
So this good guy, bad guy ideology, the Friendfo ideology, one thing that it does clearly is divide up the working class into national groups, right? I mean, a friend is a friend based on where they were born and their proximity to you, and maybe their adherence to some national project, and not based on their class position in society. But from a socialist perspective, your comrade is someone who's struggling for socialism from a working class perspective, or from a working class position, more importantly. And it does seem to me that this good guy, bad guy mentality has infected not just the elite, but it's seeped down, and you can see it in social media. Do you think that you see it there, like the way people?
Absolutely. And the difficulty is, in some sense, you do need politics to have a good guy and a bad guy. Jeff Bezos is an enemy,
Right.
Right. So this is the problem. The problem is, when does it become pathological, and when does it prevent the type of progress that we would want to see in the world? And that's a very difficult issue that I think is ultimately related, unsurprisingly, to the material conditions of a society. Ultimately.
Yeah, but the problem is like the union, they're just better at playing the good guy, bad guy game than we are. They're just better at it.
They have more power, they have more resources, and that's why they're better at it. Not because they're geniuses, because they've won.
Well, yeah, they have more power, and they can, but and the unions can't really provide you jobs,
And this goes into the history of American labor, which I said has always been more to the right than comparative labor movements in other countries. American labor was always willing to make more deals with the states, traditionally at least, than German labor or UK labor, right? And then this gets into the, I think that's ultimately traced, like, let's go real historical, to the free land in this country that was always available as sort of an escape valve for industrial labor. They could always go west until relatively recently. And I think that is a crucial explanation for why the American labor movement took the more conservative turn that it did. The material conditions of the United States are different than the UK. They're different from Germany. You always have land, or you always had land. So I think that's a real important issue that we need to think about.
It was the rural semi-feudal development of the West that served as an escape from the pressure of labor on the capitalist class in the East.
Exactly. Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Think about, when's the Homestead Act passed? In the middle of the Civil War, right? You're prepared for these sorts of escape valves over and over and over again. And it's not a surprise that some of the most radical labor movement has happened in my own home city of Seattle, the 1919 strike and the anti-WTO protests in particular, because that's where the West ends, right? And that's where all of these things are able to churn, and you get some heightening of the contradictions to the point of resistance. So I think this is a deep thing in American history that's very difficult to get a hold on.
Yeah, well, we're about 40 minutes in here, and I guess what I want to do, because we still have a little time, I think, to fill, and what would be nice to do is to talk a little bit more about Schmitt. But that's like the nerd boy in me who wants to understand the high theory stuff a little more. But you explained why Karl Schmidt became so popular, but to what extent was Schmidt's philosophy being put forward and his ideas being put forward as a part of an anti-Marxist project, do you think, as an alternative to?
I think Schmitt is best understood as an anti-liberal more than an anti-Marxist. Schmitt is really taking aim at the creation of a liberal democratic state. Now, implicit in that is Marx and Marxism is so beyond the pale that clearly they wouldn't be included in this. But Schmitt is really taking aim at what has been termed sort of the quote unquote effeteness of liberalism. It's always discussion, it's always debate. You're never able to exercise power, and that's really Schmitt's aim. Which is why a lot of Marxists, people like Otto Kirchheimer from the Frankfurt School, might be understood as left-wing Schmittians, who argued that there was something real to this friend-enemy distinction. And why it's the case that so many of the exiles, the German exiles who created the national security state after the end of the Cold War, started their careers as socialists or communists, because they understood that the friend-enemy distinction was something real, and they tried to make liberalism embrace it. And they, in fact, did make liberalism embrace it. And liberalism has been pretty goddamn successful in the last 75 years in dominating the world, partially because they took on this sort of Schmittian friend-enemy perspective.
But you can't do that and remain an internationalist, really.
No, I mean, unless you do something like the international working class, right? Then the international working class is the friend and the enemy is capitalists.
Yeah, but that's not the idea of the international working class coming together and really making a movement and a revolution for change would be one in which you don't keep that enemy is transformed, not just killed off, but transformed.
This is the problem when your socialism isn't democratic and it's revolutionary, right? Mm-hmm. This is the inevitable problem, because then if it's not consensual, then how do you force it? And this was the problem, of course, faced by communist countries throughout the 20th century.
Yeah, it was a big part of it is that but it wasn't just that it wasn't democratic, because the extent that it was like in Germany, again, I'm not an historian, I just read a bit about this, but in Germany there was a social democratic movement that was Marxist, right? That's what
I wrote my book about. Yeah, I know a ton about the SPD. So there were different divisions within it and different approaches. Basically, the division is more or less democratic. The further left you go in the SPD, the Democratic becomes eventually become communist, KPD, which they split off the SPD during World War I, partially over this question. And so this was one of the live questions of German politics in the 1920s.
Right. The question was, can we use bourgeois democracy and parliamentary forms of government to reform the capitalist system into socialism? Or do we have to smash the state and occupy the factories and use the Communist Party to set up a new mode of production, not just a new political system?
And even within even within that question of bourgeois democracy, you have what type of party should the SPD be? Should it be a workers' party or should it be a people's party? Right? Should it represent the interests of the working class? Should it represent the interests of all German people, which is by definition, as a Marxist, the interest of the working class ultimately, right? The working class embodies the interest of all of society. And so these are the questions that you ask within party structures, and if you don't have a party, et cetera, et cetera.
So, okay, last question. Where do we go on the left today after the election of Biden? I mean, I mean, it's a big, vague, stupid question, but I mean, given everything we know about the history that we've just walked through and the tensions between the U.S. and China, and the fact that really, that according to you, there's more continuity in our relationship to China between Trump and Biden than anyone would want to admit, maybe. What is the left to do? And how do we avoid, I'm going to throw in to that as well, how do we avoid embracing China in this moment? Because I think we ought to.
So I think that we should avoid embracing, you're saying.
Yeah, we should avoid embracing China, just like at a certain point it was clear, let's say in the 50s and 60s, that the Western left should avoid embracing Stalin.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I agree with that, especially given what's happening with the Uyghurs and given what's happening with the various, the CCP is no champion of democracy.
Or of workers, really, ultimately, right?
Yeah. They're champions of themselves. And the society has become increasingly bifurcated and unequal, actually, since it's developed so much. And that's something else that's important. So I would just take like my particular focus. I would say the left needs to do two things, broadly speaking, to basically get control of the apparatuses of the American state. One, it needs to create a cohort of experts who are able to do things like work in think tanks and actually manipulate the levers of state. There's currently no what might be called no vanguard of people able to do that. And the American state is just incredibly bureaucratic. That's the reality. So much of it is anti-democratic. So much of it is outside of the hands of the people that you need that expert cohort. However, at the same time, you can't just develop that expert cohort. You need to have real organization on the ground. So what does this mean? This means actually addressing a couple of really difficult things. One, union is a bad word throughout most of the United States, as the Bessemer vote probably demonstrated. Work itself has changed, right? Workers now do things like drive for Uber, work at an Amazon warehouse, work at McDonald's. So there's no shop floor upon which to build the social relationships upon which unionization and organization actually rely. So this is a major organizational question of organizational strategy that we clearly haven't come up with a way to solve. So you need to address those questions to get that sort of real organization. And to address your third question, I think you just have to make clear that we shouldn't embrace China. In my opinion, China is not a font of social democracy, a font of anti-imperialism. But at the same time, we also have to avoid inflating the threat that China actually poses to the United States, so that we don't do things like get into a World War III for no reason, or prevent the cooperation that is necessary to address climate change that you need to deal with China. But you have to do that in a way that doesn't play into liberal hands, which reinforces the power of capital. So we need to develop a left-wing way to both criticize China when it's being, going against things that doing things that we wouldn't want to do, while also leaving space to cooperate with China from a left-wing perspective that doesn't strengthen capital on issues like climate change and maybe issues of global inequality. And now these are all very difficult things to do, but I think diagnosing the problem or identifying a strategic path forward is the first step that one takes.
Well, that's great. So I think this will be a good time to announce that you're going to be publishing most likely, I think I'm going to just say you're going to be publishing a book with us. What's the title of that book that people can look for way off into the future?
The title is Imperialist Realism, which simply refers to the fact that we're kind of in this moment of stasis that I just spoke about, where we could see the problems, but there's really no clear way of how to address them. And so that is, I wrote a series of essays on this, and I'm going to write a big, long sort of framing essay on this problem.
Thanks for watching this Zero Books video. If you enjoyed it, subscribe to this channel and click on the notifications bell so that you'll be alerted whenever we release a new video. You should also consider supporting us on Patreon. Our patrons get access to our Inside Zero Books podcast every week and can get access to the Zero Books Book Club and help us to continue making online content from the left.